Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. David Watts, and we want to thank you for listening to Church History Made Simple with Dr. Watts here on the beautiful campus of Jimmy Swaggart Bible College, where you and your family are invited. If you have any questions about the Bible College, we would love to talk with you. You can email me at david.watts@jsm.org. And I would love to answer any questions you may have. Keep us in your prayers. We are currently at accreditation candidacy, and we hope to be fully accredited by October of this year, 2026. But it's still a very arduous process. We are having a lot that we have to do, but by the grace of God, we should be there. And when we do, we'll be able to actually expand our curriculum, add some programs, and so we hope to do that soon. Keep us in your prayers, and also if you're in the area, we would love to have you at Family Worship Center Church. We have Sunday morning at 10 a.m. and Sunday night at 6 p.m. and Wednesday night at 7. So Pastor Donnie Swaggart, Pastor Gabriel Swaggart, Pastor Paris Reagan, the youth pastor, Pastor Jonathan Steele, the children's pastor. There's something for all ages, so we would love to have you on Sunday or Wednesday night. Now, this season in Church History Made Simple, we are heavily focused on the Reformation period. We started off with laying the groundwork for the Reformation and then talking about the life of Martin Luther. Today we're going to go a little bit different. We're going to talk about the Anabaptists. And when you look at the Reformation and you talk about the Reformation, there are some fond reminiscence of people like Luther and Calvin among the church community, but some of the Anabaptists, they don't look at it so fondly, and we will see exactly why. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're talking about radical discipleship would be the subheading under the Anabaptist. And under the cover of darkness, a dozen or so men trudged slowly through the snow falling in Zurich on January 21st, 1525. Quietly but resolutely, they made their way through those narrow streets, and the wintry chill blowing off the lake seemed to match their mood as they approached the man's house, man's, M-A-N-Z, man's, and probably in German, it's probably Mons, near the Great Minster, the largest church in town. The city council of Zurich had that day ordered their leaders, Conrad Grebel and Felix Mons, to stop holding Bible classes. Opposition was mounting. Only 4 days before, the council had warned all parents to have their babies baptized within 8 days of birth or face banishment from the territory. What were the brethren going to do? They agreed to meet at the Mons house to decide. Once inside, they shared their rumors and reports, and then they called upon God to enable them to do His will. So they arose from prayer, and they take action in one of the most decisive things in Christian history. George Blaurock, a former priest, stepped over to Conrad Grebel and asked him for baptism in the apostolic fashion. So what does that mean, baptism in the apostolic fashion? I'm glad that you asked. Upon confession of personal faith in Jesus Christ, Grebel baptized him on the spot, and Blaurock proceeded to baptize the others. Thus, Anabaptism, another important expression of the Protestant Reformation, was born that day. Anabaptism being baptized in what they called the apostolic fashion upon confession of personal faith in Jesus Christ. Today, the direct descendants of the Anabaptists are the Mennonites and the Hutterites. Americans probably think of them as just bearded farmers and bonnet-covered ladies driving horses and buggies across the Pennsylvania countryside. Now, Pennsylvania is probably the most thought of when it comes to the Mennonites, but there are Mennonite communities. I've been running across some in some towns that I didn't think there would be. There's a large Mennonite community in West Texas, and there's some in Oklahoma, and there's spread, but probably Pennsylvania and Iowa are probably the most common ones. No automobiles and no zippers on Mennonite clothing. No automobiles, no zippers. In fact, only one section of the Mennonites, the Old Order Amish, holds tenaciously to the old ways. The majority of Mennonites look like most other Americans and consume their share of energy like the rest of us. What unites the various types of Mennonites is not a style of dress or a mode of transportation, but a shared set of beliefs and values. Many of these beliefs are now accepted by the Christians, so the distant relatives of the Anabaptists today would include, of course, the Quakers, but also the Baptists and the Congregationalists. In fact, in their belief in the separation of church and state, the Anabaptists proved to be the forerunners of practically all modern Protestants. So the Anabaptists were very, very much inclined to the separation of church and state, and that is the state not being able to speak into the affairs of the church, not vice versa. The church, of course, is to speak into the civil, but the civil is not to speak and control the ecclesiastical. Why is that? How could a people so intent on restoring New Testament Christianity come to be so far ahead of their time? Like the Benedictine monks of an earlier day, the Anabaptists demonstrate that those who live most devoutly for the world to come are often in the best position to change the present. In a sense, the rise of Anabaptism was no surprise. Most revolutionary movements produce a wing of radicals who feel called of God to reform the Reformation. So we will see every time a large group gets in power, the Lutherans unseat the Catholics politically in a lot of provinces, the princes start to embrace Lutheranism. Well, then they become corrupt, and another group rises, and another group rises. We see that all through church history. So a voice calling the moderate reformers to strike even more deeply at the foundations of the old order or the old apostolic things. Like most movements, Anabaptists lack cohesiveness. No single body of doctrine, no unifying organization prevailed among them. Even the name Anabaptist was pinned on them by their enemies. It was meant as an insult. What the word Anabaptist means is rebaptizer or rebaptized. It was intended to associate the radicals with heretics and subject them to severe persecution. And that actually succeeded very much, to call them the rebaptizers, because according to Catholicism and even to Lutheranism, you were baptized as an infant, you were christened, you had a sprinkling. So now why do you want to be rebaptized? Why do you want to be baptized in what the Anabaptists would call the apostolic fashion? Actually, the Anabaptists rejected all thoughts of rebaptism because why did they said, we're not rebaptists, we're not rebaptizers. Why? Because the ceremonial sprinkling that they got as infancy, they said that's not valid baptism. That's not even valid. So they much preferred Baptist as a designation. To most of them, however, the fundamental issue was not baptism, it was the nature of the church and its relation to civil government. So baptism is not even the main issue. The main issue was the relation of the church to the civil government. They had come to their convictions, like most other Protestants, through Scripture. Luther had taught that common people have a right to search the Bible for themselves. It had been his guide to salvation, so why not others? Luther's life was changed by reading Romans 1:17, so why can't others read to have their life changed? As a result, little groups of Anabaptist believers gathered about their Bibles. They discovered a different world in the pages of the New Testament. They found no state church alliance, no Christendom. To them, there was no Christendom. There was no state church alliance. Instead, they discovered the apostolic churches were companies of committed believers, communities of men and women who had freely and personally chosen to follow Jesus. And for the 16th century, that was a revolutionary idea. In spite of Luther's stress on personal religion, Lutheran churches were established churches. They retained an ordained clergy who considered the whole population of a given territory members of their church. The churches looked to the state for salary and support. Official Protestantism to the Anabaptists seemed to differ little from official Catholicism. They didn't see the difference. Anabaptists wanted to change all that. Their goal was the restitution of apostolic Christianity, or a return to churches of true believers. In the early church, they said men and women who had experienced personal spiritual regeneration were only fit subjects for baptism. The apostolic churches knew nothing of the practice of baptizing infants. I have to agree with what their assessment was, that we don't see scripturally the baptizing of infants. That tradition was simply a convenient device for perpetuating Christendom. Nominal but spiritually impotent Christian society is how the Anabaptists would describe the practice of infant baptism, that it would create a nominal but spiritually impotent Christian society. The true church, the radicals insisted, is always a community of saints, dedicated disciples in a wicked world. Like the missionary monks of the Middle Ages, the Anabaptists wanted to shape society by their example of radical discipleship, even if necessary, even by death. They wanted to show a radical Christianity. They steadfastly refused to be a part of worldly power, including bearing arms, holding political office, and taking oaths. In the 16th century, this independence from social and civic society was seen as an inflammatory, revolutionary, or even treasonous. The radicals found their best opportunities to preach in Switzerland, the Rhineland, and Holland. By mid-century, three groups appeared in German-speaking Europe. The Swiss Brethren were led by Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz at Zurich. Number two, the Hutterites Brethren of Moravia. And number three, the Mennonites in the Netherlands and northern Germany. Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz were first supporters of the fledgling Reformation in Zurich, led by Ulrich Zwingli, who lived, that was from 1484 to 1531. Zwingli, one of the names you'll hear most commonly affiliated with the Reformation. So Grebel and Manz were supporters of Zwingli in Zurich. In 1519, the year Luther debated John Eck at Leipzig, Zwingli became the people's priest at the Great Minster Church in Zurich. He launched a Reformation not by posting theses on the church door, but by preaching biblical sermons from the pulpit. Under the influence of the famous scholar Erasmus, Zwingli had come to revere the language and message of the New Testament. So again, we see the importance of getting the Bible into the language of the common person and preaching, the importance of preaching. The Reformers would hold a high value on preaching. So his messages created quite a stir in Zurich. One of his listeners was a young man named Thomas Platter. Said when he heard the long-neglected Bible explained, he felt as if Zwingli were lifting him by the hair of his head. Wanting to hear the Bible, to him it was like being lifted up by the hair of his head. In one important respect, Zwingli followed the Bible even more stringently than did Luther. The Wittenberger would allow whatever the Bible did not prohibit. Zwingli rejected whatever the Bible did not prescribe. For this reason, the Reformation in Zurich tended to strip away more traditional symbols of the Roman Church: candles, statues, music, and pictures. Later in England, they would call this spirit Puritanism. So this is the foundation. Zwingli stripping away even what the Lutherans allowed, no symbols of the Roman Church at all. This would be called Puritanism. Grable and Mans, both well-educated men of standing in Zurich, supported Zwingli's initial reforms, but following the reformers' lead, the study of the Bible, they came to see the obvious differences in the apostolic churches and those of their own day. In Zurich city-state, as in the rest of the Christian world, every newborn child was baptized and considered a member of the church. As a result, church and society were identical or interchangeable. The church was simply everybody's church. In the New Testament, however, the church was a fellowship of the few, a company of true believers committed to live and die for their Lord. That is the kind of church Grable and Mans wanted in Zurich, a church free from the state, composed of true disciples. The baptism of believers was merely the most striking feature of this new kind of church. Zwingli, however, would have no part of this revolution. He needed the support of the city fathers. In the fall of 1524, when Grable's wife gave birth to a son, all the theories faced a test of action. Would the baby be baptized? The Grables refused, and other parents followed their example. To deal with the crisis, the City Council of Zurich arranged a public debate on the question for January 17, 1525. After hearing arguments on both sides of the issue, representatives of the people declared Zwingli and his disciples as the winners. As a result, the council warned all parents who had neglected to have their children baptized to do so within a week or face banishment from Zurich. That was the background for the historic baptism at the Mans house, or Man's house, however you German-speaking people will probably correct me. On January 21st, it was clearly an act of defiance, but it was much more. Grable, Mans, and their followers had counted the costs. That is why shortly after the baptism, the little company withdrew from Zurich to the nearby village of Zollikon. Here, late in January, the first Anabaptist congregation, or the first free church, this is called the free church. And why is it the free church? It's free of state tithes. Bonhoeffer was a member of the Free Church. I mean, there are several famous people would be what was called the Free Church, free of state tithes, and this was when it was born. The authorities in Zurich would not overlook the rebellion. They sent police to Zollikon and arrested the newly baptized men, and they imprisoned them. They imprisoned them for being baptized. This is crazy to think about. But as soon as they were released, the Anabaptists went to neighboring towns in search of converts. Finally, the Zurich Council lost all patience. On March 7, 1526, it decided that anyone found rebaptizing would be put to death by drowning. Apparently, their thought was, if the heretics want water, we'll let them have it. I mean, can you imagine Christian on Christian martyrdom based on water baptism? Within a year, on January 5th, 1527, Felix Mans becomes the first Anabaptist martyr. The Zurich authorities drowned him in the Limmat, which flows through the city of the Limmat, that's Limmat, a river that flows through the city. Within 4 years, the radical movement in and around Zurich was practically eradicated. Many of the persecuted fled to Germany and Austria, but their prospects were no brighter there. In 1529, the imperial Diet of Speyer proclaimed Anabaptism a heresy, and every court in Christendom was obliged to condemn the heretics to death. During the Reformation years, between 4,000 and 5,000 Anabaptists were executed by fire, water, and sword. You heard me right, 4,000 to 5,000 of the Anabaptists. That's why I said at the beginning that to the Mennonites, to those of Anabaptist background, they are not so fond of the Reformation. To us, the Anabaptists seem to have made a simple demand, a person's right to his own beliefs. But in the 16th century, the heretics seemed to be destroying the very fabric of society. That is why the voice of conscience was so often silenced by martyrdom. Among the early Anabaptist missionaries who carried their message east and along the Alps to the region of Tyrol was George Blaurock. Catholic authorities were persecuted the Anabaptists intensely, And on September 6, 1529, Blaurock himself was burned at the stake. So the very first baptism in water, he becomes a missionary sharing this message, and he himself is then burned at the stake. So that is just a brief overview. And again, all of these we're touching very briefly on, but that is an overview of the Anabaptist message, which is a very integral part of the Reformation. So for the sake of time, we are almost at the 20-minute mark. I'm going to stop there, and we're going to continue next week. But if you have any questions, any comments, be sure to let me know. One of the best ways is to get on the Facebook page for this podcast, and you can message me there, or you can email me, david.watts@jsm.org. Thank you very much for listening.